This is the best apple pie. It actually is award-winning, and I've been working on mastering how to make great pie for many, many years now. I think it's equal parts science and love, and I'm going to share with you all of my best tips. My perfect apple pie has an incredibly crispy and flaky crust, and the filling is wonderfully spiced with big chunks of tender apples and just enough sauce to hold it together. I want my pie to be a masterpiece, a work of art. I want someone to have a slice of this pie and say, "Oh my gosh, that is the finest pie I've ever had." And that's what I'm going to show you today, so let's get started. In an apple pie, I think the crust and filling are equally important. I want a crust that is supremely flaky, and in order to achieve that, we're going to laminate the dough. It's a little extra step, but it is well worth it. And by the way, you can make this gluten-free or regular. Here's what you'll need for the crust. I have 2.5 cups of flour. You can use all-purpose or a gluten-free flour blend. I like Pamela's. Plus, I've added a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. You'll need some ice water, and the amount depends on if you're doing gluten-free or regular. And then 2 sticks of really good butter, and each stick cut into about 20 pieces, and it should be cold. Really cold right out of the fridge. Now, if you're making this gluten-free, you need 2 additional ingredients. You need a little bit of sugar, like 2 teaspoons, and you also need to add some extra xanthan gum, even if your flour blend already has it. There are 2 secrets to making a really good gluten-free pie crust, and this is one of them, so don't skip it. Mix the dry ingredients together, which if you're making a regular crust, that's just the flour and salt, and if it's gluten-free, mix in the additional sugar and xanthan gum. Now add in all the butter, and I know some people like to make pie dough in a food processor, and I have done it that way in the past as well, but there's just no comparison to the quality, to the flakiness that you'll achieve in your crust when mixing it by hand. So toss all those cubes of butter into the flour and get them all nicely coated. The next step is to shingle the butter or to squeeze it flat just like this. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to pick up each piece of butter and I'm going to squeeze it. Now it's okay if they fall apart. These are kind of long, so they probably will break in half, and that's fine. But I'm just going to keep working through all of these until they're all flattened. This is actually really fun and pretty satisfying to do. It's probably my favorite part about making pie. I love squeezing the butter. So just keep squeezing them, keep tossing them around in the flour. You should be able to feel when you've gotten them all. Now we're going to add the water, which is a pretty critical step in making pie dough because we don't want to overhydrate this. We don't want to add too much water right away because if that happens, you can end up with a tough pie crust and not a lovely flaky pie crust like we want. And this is definitely where experience and where kind of the art of making a beautiful pie crust comes into play, but I am going to try to articulate it the best I can. So if you're using regular flour, you're going to start with 1/4 cup of water, and if you're using gluten-free, you're going to start with 1/3 because it will absorb more water. And how I do it is I get the coldest water that I can from my tap and measure it out into my cup, and then I add a couple ice cubes and keep them in there for just a minute to help chill it even more. Now we're going to squeeze it and knead it, kind of a hybrid between the two. And it's going to look dry and it's going to feel dry, but resist the temptation to add more water. We still have a ways to go before we're even going to think or consider if we need to add more water to this. It'll continue to hydrate as you squeeze it and as you move it around, and some of the butter will melt from the heat of your hands just around the edges, and that will also moisten the flour. So just keep kneading it and keep squeezing it. This could take several minutes before it comes together. What I'm ultimately looking for is for this to hold together in a ball when I squeeze it. Now, I'm not looking for all of the entire bowl of dough to hold together in one big ball, but just the handfuls that I'm picking up and squeezing, they do stay together, and that is almost perfect. It's been a few minutes, and I am seeing that there's a little bit of flour and a little bit of crumbs kind of in the bottom of the bowl that aren't picking up into a ball, that are reluctant to join in. So I'm going to add just the teeniest amount of water, like 1 teaspoon. There, can you see the difference? What's left in the bottom of the bowl looks more like little balls of dough. They're starting to stick together to each other rather than just loose flour and really dry flour. So I think that this looks perfect. Now we're going to wrap this up in plastic wrap. Since this is a double crust worth of dough, I have 2 sheets of plastic wrap kind of overlapping here just to make sure that I can cover it all. And I know that it still looks dry here and it doesn't look like it's going to come together, but I promise it will. It's going to continue to hydrate as it sits in the fridge, and it's going to hydrate even more as we roll it out. One thing I'm doing here is using the plastic wrap to help me. I'm really using it to help cinch up the dough and bring it together and keep it together. And I'm forming this into a long rectangle, kind of a log or a loaf shape, and not a circle. We're not ready to roll this out into a circular pie crust yet. And now that I have this in a long rectangle, which I'd say is probably about 10 inches by 3 inches, I'm going to push it down and flatten it out just a little bit so that it's easier to roll when I take it out of the fridge. We need this dough to chill back down again because we've been monkeying with it for a while now, so I'm going to put it in the fridge to chill for 30 minutes. And now we're going to do something called laminating the dough, which is the other secret to making a really great pie crust, especially if you're using gluten-free flour. Do not skip this step. And this is probably the worst part about making homemade pie crust. It's not hard to do, but it is a bit of physical labor. You will, however, be rewarded with the flakiest crust ever. I start by putting the dough between 2 pieces of parchment paper, and I'm not looking to really roll this out much more than it already is, but I do want to flatten it just a little bit more. You'll notice that my dough is cracking a little bit here, which is just because it's cold and I need to let it warm up for a minute, and also because it's gluten-free. If you're working with regular flour dough, you will notice that it looks and behaves a lot better. And now we're going to fold the dough, and this is the first step in laminating it. Laminating just means layers. So we're going to fold it a few times and create a lot of layers, which is the same technique they use when making croissants. And after folding it once, I'm just going to roll it out again until it's a similar shape and size to what it was before. I'm really not going for any kind of perfection here, just a long rectangle that I can fold in half again easily. And I'm going to do it again. I'm going to fold the dough, and then I'm going to roll it out into a rectangle, and I'm going to do that over and over until I have folded it 6 times. This is fold number 6, my last fold, and you can see here how much better the dough is looking. It looks a lot more cohesive, a lot smoother, and a lot more hydrated. Now, because this is a double crust worth of dough, we need to cut it in half. You're going to have enough for a bottom crust plus either a full top crust or a lattice crust on top, whatever you choose. And I actually like to cut this a little off center. I do more like a 60-40 so that the bottom crust has more and we get more of that edge crust, which is my favorite. We are almost done with these crusts. Thank goodness, this is such a labor of love. The last step is to form them into a circle shape and into a disc. And the more perfectly round you can get this now, the easier time you're going to have later when you go to roll this out into a circular crust. So I'm smashing in the corners. I'm going to roll it like a wheel on the counter, whatever it takes to get this into a circular disc. Once I'm satisfied with the shape, I'm just going to wrap it up in the plastic wrap, and then I like to smush it down a little bit more. I just think it makes it easier to roll it out later. And then I'm going to put this in the fridge. This needs to chill again for about 30 minutes, though you can actually make the dough a day or 2 ahead of time and keep it in the fridge just like this until you're ready to use it. I'm not going to make you watch me roll out this second piece of dough, but I did want to show you what it looks like on the inside. Look at all those layers, all those streaks of butter. That is the flakiness. All right, let's talk pie filling. I really like to pre-cook my apple filling for a couple reasons. And number 1, I can stuff way more apples into this pie than I could otherwise. And number 2, pre-cooking the filling will pre-wilt it and pre-shrink it so I can see what the final volume of the filling is going to be, and it's not going to shrink anymore in the oven, so it's not going to leave a big gap between the top of the filling and the crust. Now, when it comes to the apples you're going to use, I have 2 main rules. Number 1, make sure you're using apples that are meant for pie. Apples that will hold their shape when they're baked so you don't end up with an applesauce pie. Rule number 2, if at all possible, use more than 1 type of apple in your pie. In fact, I like to use 3 because each different variety of apple has different apple notes, and when you put them all together, you get a really robust and well-rounded apple flavor. As far as what varieties to use, usually if they're crisp or dense, they hold up pretty well in pie. My favorite is Honeycrisp, but you can also use Granny Smith, Braeburn, Pink Lady. There are lots. The other ingredients that you'll need for the filling are sugar. I'm using a 1/2 cup granulated sugar, 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, and 3 tablespoons of either all-purpose flour or your gluten-free flour blend. And then, of course, a little bit of salt. As far as the spices go, I like a moderately spiced pie, and I like to keep the flavor pretty classic. So, of course, I'm going to use cinnamon, and this is my favorite cinnamon from Burlap and Barrel. It is so fragrant and so delicious. And then I'm also going to use allspice. And to me, allspice is the thing that makes apple pie actually taste like apple pie. And then I'm also going to use nutmeg, just a little bit to help round out the spice profile. I like to make sure my spices are fresh at the start of baking season because I think it makes such a difference and will really help to make your pie shine. So for the cinnamon, I'm using 1 teaspoon, and for the allspice, just a 1/4 teaspoon. You really just need a little bit of this, especially when it's good and strong. If you want to try burlap and barrel spices, I will put a link for them in the video description below. They are my absolute favorite. And now for the nutmeg, of course, you can use already grated if that's what you have, but I always like to grate mine fresh. I think it tastes so much better. Now I'm going to mix all of these ingredients together, and this is a really important step because we're cooking this pie filling. When we go to add this spice mixture to the warm apples, the flour will just clump if it's not mixed in with the sugar. It'll form little weird dough balls, so I'm going to mix this up really well. To peel or not to peel your apples? Well, I could actually argue that either way. There is a lot of flavor underneath the peels and in the peels, so you are removing that. However, I typically don't like the texture of a pie with peels in it quite as much. So especially if I'm making this for company, I will always peel my apples. And here's how I like to cut them. I first take the big slabs off the sides, and then I'm left with these little slabs, which I cut away from the core. And then of course I'm going to discard the core, and these little slabs, I'm going to cut each of these into either 2 or 3 slices, depending on how big they are. I like a big chunky apple slice for my pie, and I think that these look perfect. For this type of pie filling, a pre-cooked pie filling, I think it's best to cut the apples into pretty large slices. So I'm going for 1/2 inch here. They're going to hold their shape really well. We're going to have big bites of apples in our pie, and because we're pre-cooking it, they'll definitely be tender by the time the pie is done. And you will need 9 cups of peeled sliced apples, which is around 3 pounds, or anywhere from 7 to 9 whole large apples. Use a larger, wider pot if you have it, and add 2 tablespoons of water along with the apples. This is going to help them steam. I'm going to cover the pot and turn on the heat to medium. We're going to cook these until they're ever so slightly tender, which will take about 16 to 18 minutes, and I'm going to come through every few minutes and give them a light stir, being very gentle so I don't break them up. And I'm going to replace the cover between stirrings. And here's what they'll look like when they're ready. They're a little bit wilty, a little bit soft around the edges, and a little bit tender. This is perfect. Now, with the heat still on, I'm going to add in the sugar, flour, and spice mixture that we made, and I'm going to start to fold it in. This is a critical point. The apples are in a little bit of a vulnerable state. They're starting to get soft, so you want to be very gentle. You can see here I'm doing a folding motion. I'm scraping around the sides and the bottom of the pan, and I'm trying to get all of that flour sugar mixture incorporated into the apples. And because the heat is on, the flour is going to start to cook, which is what we want. And as it cooks, it's going to absorb all the moisture from the pan and from the apples, and it's going to start to form the goo. And it's going to go from a more loose, silkier goo to a thicker goo, and that's when you know it's done, and it's going to take about 2 minutes. It's really important to stir this almost continually for the entire 2 minutes, and making sure to scrape the bottom of the pan so that it doesn't burn. And here it is at its thick goo stage. You can see it looks just like pie filling. It looks great. I'm going to turn off the heat, and I'm going to remove the pan from the stove so that it can cool as quickly as possible. We need to let this pie filling cool before we actually put it into the pie crust. Otherwise, it'll melt and make the pie dough a little bit weird. So make sure you cool this to room temperature. You can even make this ahead of time the day before and keep it in the fridge overnight. All right, moving on to pie assembly. We are getting so close to actually having a pie here. I like to use a metal pie pan. I think it gets you a crispier crust. I much prefer it to glass. Of course, we have our pie doughs, and these have been chilling in the fridge for 30 minutes. If you keep them in the fridge for any longer than that, you might have to let them warm up just a touch before you start to roll them out. I'm going to use a pizza cutter. I'm going to be making a lattice crust, and I like this tool for cutting the dough strips. And then as far as what to brush on top of your crust, I really like cream. You can either use cream or an egg wash, which is just a beaten egg. And then I'm going to sprinkle on some coarse sugar on top of that. I really like the way it looks and tastes. And of course, you will need a pastry brush for brushing on the cream or egg. Oh good, more dough rolling. Can you tell this is my least favorite part about making pie? This isn't so bad. This actually goes pretty quick. I'm going to use parchment paper again, and I'm also going to use just a little bit of flour because I don't want it to stick to the parchment paper, which it sometimes can do. And I'm using like the teeniest sprinkling of flour because I don't want to incorporate more than I have to. I think rolling a circle of pie dough is actually pretty easy. The way to think about it is to always think about going from the middle to the outside edges. Always roll from the middle out. And because you started with your perfectly circular disc of dough, you're going to have no problem at all rolling this out into a lovely circular pie crust. Do pay attention to what you're doing and monitor the shape as you're rolling it, because if it starts to get a little bit wonky, it's easier to correct it earlier on. I also like to stop rolling for a second when I'm about midway there, just to check and make sure that the parchment is not sticking. So I'll lift the parchment off. I'll even flip it over and check the other side too. If it's starting to get sticky, it'll get stickier the thinner it gets. So I'm gonna add just a teensy bit more flour here. Keep rolling until your pie dough is 1/8 of an inch thick, and get out a tape measure if you need. You really want to make sure that this isn't too thick, because if it is, it will not cook properly and it'll end up kind of gummy. It's really common for your pie dough to be thin and perfect on the outer edges, but a little bit thicker in the middle. So make sure that's not happening. Make sure it's uniform throughout. I think this looks perfect. What I like to do next is take my pie pan and set it upside down on the dough. This lets me know that it's big enough, and it is. I can see that I have at least a couple inches of dough all the way around. And now I can easily trim it up. I really only want about 2 inches of dough overhanging this pan. Any more than that and it's just too much crust, it doesn't cook very well. So I'm going to go through just using a butter knife to cut off the extra. And now the flip. I'm just going to put my hand in the center of the pan and flip the whole thing over. And then off comes the parchment paper. Do this gently and a little bit slowly so that if it is sticking in places, you don't just rip a hole in your beautiful crust. And now you can start to shape the dough. What I'm going to do is push it into the bottom of the pan, really making sure that I push it into the corner, that bottom edge corner, so it makes good contact. And then I'm going to stick it in the fridge to chill while I roll out the other crust. So here's the thing. You have to cover the top of your pie with something. You can't just leave an apple pie open air. It will dry out too much in the oven. So you could use a crumble topping. That's always a good option. Or you can take this whole sheet of second dough and drape the whole thing over the top. Or you can make a lattice crust, which is my favorite. I just think it is the most beautiful way to decorate a pie. There's also lots of ways to do a lattice crust. You could make really skinny strips or fat strips. You can even do a decorative strip that's braided. Lots of options. I'm going with a pretty classic, pretty middle of the road, about 1 inch strip. I think this is nice and not too fussy, not too time consuming, and it still looks really pretty. I've got everything ready to go. My bottom crust is rolled out and in the pan. My top crust is rolled out and cut into lattice strips. My pie filling is cooked and chilled. And most importantly, the oven is preheated. You want to make sure that you really preheat the oven before you put this pie into it. And speaking of temperature, one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, but I wanted to because it's an important part of pie making, is that you should always keep the crust cold or at least cool. You never want this to warm up to room temperature, so work quickly and stick it back in the fridge if you have to at any point. Make sure that when you put the pie into the oven, the crust is fairly cool. Once you have the filling packed in there nicely with no air holes, it's time to put the lattice on. And I think that this is one of those tasks where the more I think about it, the harder it is. So don't think about it too hard. But here are a few tips. I counted my strips. I have 12 strips, which means I can put 6 one way and 6 the other way. Now make sure you match them up. And what I mean by that is the middle strip and the lattice, the longest strip, should go in the middle of the pie. And the strips on the outer edges, which are a little bit shorter, should go on the edges of the pie. Does that make sense? The goal here is to weave it, or at least to make it look woven. And the way to do that is to pull up every other strip of dough, just like I'm doing here. And now take your strip, and because I'm working in the middle of the pie, I'm going to take my middle longest lattice strip, place it down, and then flip those other strips right back over it. Now lift up the opposite strips, the ones that you just covered with dough, flip those ones up, and then take another one of your lattice strips and place that over top. And then flip those ones down over it. And you can see here how this is going to start to look woven. And make sure that you start this in the middle of the pie. Don't start at one end and work to the other. Start in the middle and just keep doing this over and over until you've got the whole thing covered. We need to get rid of some of this extra dough, so I'm going to go through and cut off all these little lattice edges right where they meet the pie tin. As much as I love crust, and I do, trust me, I love crust, it gets to be too much and it doesn't cook very good and it gets gummy if you don't remove these. And now we can form the outer crust. Typically when I make a crust, I would roll the pie dough underneath, but whenever I have a lattice on top, I like to roll it up and inward. I think it makes a nicer, more finished looking top of the pie. So pick a spot and start rolling and keep rolling until you get to the other side. And notice here that I am trying to roll this fairly tightly. And now we're going to make it look pretty. There are so many different ways that you can shape a crust. I'm going with the classic finger poke and squeeze, which it's not called that. I don't know what it's called, but this is how my grandma did it, and this is how I'm going to do it. And now for the cream wash. This is just plain heavy cream. You can use this or you can use an egg wash, which is just 1 egg beaten. And I like both. This ends up being a little bit more matte where an egg is more shiny. The reason that I don't use an egg wash is simply because my farm fresh eggs have such vibrant yellow yolks that it gives the top of the crust kind of a yellow hue that I don't really love. Otherwise, I probably would use an egg. I'm brushing every surface of the crust that I see, both the outer crust and the top lattice, and I'm trying to do just a light coat. I don't want to goop this on. I don't want it to be really heavy. I'm also trying to get it in all the crevices of the lattice, like where 2 of the lattice strips come together. I want the whole thing to be covered. And now for the sugar. I'm using a large granule coarse sugar because I like the way that it looks. You can find this under the name sugar in the raw, or sometimes called turbinado sugar. Of course, you could use regular old granulated sugar as well. And I'm sprinkling it wherever there is cream, on every surface of the crust, the outer crust, which I'm trying not to get it on the pie pan, and of course all over the lattice top as well. This beauty is finally ready to go in the oven. I'm going to bake it at 425 degrees for 20 minutes, and then I'm going to decrease the temperature to 375 and bake it for another 40 minutes or until it looks like this. The most important thing to look for to know your pie is done is when you see that filling bubbling out of it just like this. You need to see that, otherwise your pie is probably not done. You also want that crust to be deeply, deeply golden brown, so leave it in the oven until it is. Here it is in some better light. Let me tell you, if you've never made a pie from scratch before, this is one of the most satisfying things you can create. Serving an apple pie, there are actually a few things to know about this. The first and most important is that you must let your pie cool for at least about 3 hours until you cut it. Otherwise, when you go to lift it out, all of that beautiful filling is going to run right out of it. You need to let it cool and solidify so that it looks just like this. I actually think apple pie tastes best cold the next day, so I always let mine chill in the fridge overnight. And now I'm going to sacrifice this crust to show you, because I want to show you how beautiful this is and how flaky and crispy this crust turned out. I also wanted to show you the inside of the pie up close. And if you can't pick up your pie like this, gluten-free or regular, you've not cooked it quite right. This is such a lovely filling. Big chunks of tender apples, lots of nice sauce in there, but it's not runny. And the crust is beautiful. It's so flaky on the outside. And the bottom, look at how brown and crisp that is. No soggy crust here. If you ask me, this is the perfect apple pie. All it needs, if you wish, is 1 scoop of vanilla ice cream. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and if you found this video helpful. I hope you did. I hope you can make a beautiful pie. I would love it if you could give it a thumbs up, and make sure to subscribe to my channel so that you are the first to know whenever a new video is posted.